Marilyn Monroe in Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, 1953. She sparkled in diamonds, sang about being a girl's best friend, and cemented herself as the ultimate screen diva. Yet behind the iconic smile, Marilyn Monroe quietly resented the role that made her immortal. Gentlemen Prefer Blondes gave audiences an unforgettable performance. But to Monroe, it was also a gilded cage. By 1953, Monroe was already becoming a household name. She had stolen scenes in Niagara, but it was Gentlemen Prefer Blondes that elevated her to superstardom. Cast as Lorelei Lee, the blonde bombshell obsessed with jewels and wealthy men, Monroe was dazzling. Her comedic timing, breathy voice, and sheer screen presence made the role unforgettable. The song, "Diamonds Are a Girl's Best Friend," became one of the most iconic numbers in Hollywood history, endlessly imitated for decades to come. But while audiences adored her, Monroe felt something far more complicated. Beneath the surface, she despised being typecast as the dumb blonde. She longed to be respected as a serious actress, not simply a pretty face. In her own words, she once confessed, "The trouble is, I'm a woman. The trouble is, I'm a blonde. The trouble is, I'm a sex symbol. That's no part of me." The role of Lorelei Lee only magnified this frustration. Though it brought her fame and fortune, it also locked her into a screen persona that she could never escape. 20th Century Fox marketed her as the ultimate object of glamour, ignoring her pleas for deeper roles. Monroe fought tirelessly against this image, even enrolling in acting classes with Lee Strasberg at the Actors Studio in New York, searching for a craft beyond the stereotype. Behind the scenes of Gentlemen Prefer Blondes, Monroe's insecurities clashed with studio control. Her co-star Jane Russell often defended her, noting how Monroe would stay late rehearsing lines and worrying over her performance. Russell reportedly called her the hardest working actress I ever knew. Yet the press rarely acknowledged her dedication. They focused instead on her beauty, her figure, and the way she shimmered under studio lights. What hurt Monroe most was the belief that the public would never take her seriously. Years later, she admitted that she didn't even enjoy watching Gentlemen Prefer Blondes because it reminded her of how studios pigeonhole her. Bette Davis and Beyond the Forest, 1949. What a dump! The line became immortal, later parodied and quoted for decades. But at the time of its release in Beyond the Forest, 1949, Bette Davis wasn't laughing. She loathed the film, despised the role, and resented the studio for forcing her into it. For one of Hollywood's fiercest and most respected actresses, this film stood as the bitter end of her long war with Warner Brothers. Bette Davis had already carved out a reputation as one of the greatest actresses of her generation. With 2 Academy Awards under her belt for Dangerous and Jezebel, she was known for her commanding presence, fiery personality, and willingness to play complex, often unlikable women. Unlike many of her peers, Davis had little interest in being a glamorous ornament on screen. She wanted meteor roles that showed her skill, but Hollywood was changing. The studio system was tightening its grip, and Warner Brothers, where Davis had been under contract, often clashed with her. She had battled Jack Warner repeatedly, demanding better scripts, more freedom, and higher quality projects. Sometimes she won, starring in films like Now Voyager and The Letter. But other times, the studio reminded her who was in charge. Beyond the Forest became that reminder. In the film, Davis played Rosa Moline, a bored and bitter small-town housewife who dreams of escaping her dull life and will stop at nothing to achieve it. The role was meant to be sensational, but Davis found it ridiculous. She was in her 40s by then, and the studio still tried to mold her into a vampish femme fatale. To Davis, it was an insult to her artistry and an example of how studios miscast their most talented performers. She reportedly begged Warner Brothers not to make her do the film. She even quipped that the only thing she liked about it was leaving the set at the end of the day. Critics later agreed with her. Many called the role unconvincing and the film overwrought. Davis herself later dismissed it as a terrible movie, one she wished she could erase from her career. What made the experience even more painful was how it symbolized the end of her contract with Warner Brothers. For nearly 2 decades, she had fought for better scripts, for roles worthy of her ability. And in the end, the studio handed her Beyond the Forest, a film she despised, as her swan song. Charlton Heston and Planet of the Apes, 1968. Few final scenes in cinema are as haunting as Charlton Heston kneeling in the sand, staring at the ruins of the Statue of Liberty, crying out in despair. Planet of the Apes, 1968, wasn't just a box office hit. It was a cultural earthquake. It blended science fiction, social commentary, and spectacle in a way that audiences had never seen before. But for Charlton Heston, the film was a complicated triumph. While it cemented his image as a Hollywood giant of epic proportions, it was also a role he would later regard with a degree of regret. By the time he accepted the role of astronaut George Taylor, Heston was already one of the industry's most recognizable faces. He had led Chariots in Ben-Hur, a performance that earned him an Academy Award. He had commanded armies in the Ten Commandments and stood tall in historical epics like El Cid. For audiences, Heston was a man carved out of granite, a hero larger than life. When his name appeared above a film title, it guaranteed gravitas. So when Planet of the Apes came along, many saw it as a strange detour. Science fiction still carried a stigma. It was often relegated to B-movies with low budgets, rubber masks, and campy dialogue. For Heston, taking on a sci-fi role risked undermining the dignity he had built through his career. He reportedly hesitated, but was persuaded by the intelligence of the script. Adapted loosely from Pierre Boulle's novel, the film wasn't mere pulp. It carried biting commentary about race, war, and humanity's self-destruction. The production itself was groundbreaking. The makeup work by John Chambers, which transformed actors into apes with stunning realism, earned an honorary Academy Award. The film's twist ending became one of the most famous in movie history. Yet, Heston himself later confessed mixed feelings. He struggled with the film's bleakness, particularly the way his character ended not as a triumphant hero, but as a broken man raging against humanity's folly. For an actor used to epic victories and moral certainty, Taylor's despair left him uneasy. Adding to his frustration was the sequel process. Heston had no interest in returning for Beneath the Planet of the Apes, 1970. He felt the story had already been told, and repeating it would cheapen the original's impact. After much persuasion, he reluctantly agreed to appear, but only on the condition that his role be brief and that Taylor die early in the film. It was his way of distancing himself from the franchise that, despite its brilliance, never quite aligned with how he saw his career. Katharine Hepburn and Spitfire, 1934. For much of her career, Katharine Hepburn seemed untouchable, a woman of sharp wit, fierce independence, and undeniable talent. She became one of the most decorated actresses in history, eventually winning 4 Academy Awards. Yet even someone of Hepburn's caliber had roles she regretted. Among them, none stood out more to her than Spitfire, 1934, a film she later dismissed with characteristic bluntness as absurd. Hepburn was still relatively new to Hollywood, but she was already making waves. After a celebrated stage career, she burst onto the screen in A Bill of Divorcement, 1932, followed quickly by Morning Glory, 1933, which earned her the first of her Oscars. She was young, ambitious, and determined to prove she could play anything. RKO Pictures, sensing her rising star power, rushed to find projects to showcase her. That urgency led to Spitfire. In the film, Hepburn played Trigger Hicks, an uneducated mountain girl accused by her neighbors of practicing witchcraft. It was meant to be a vehicle for her dramatic abilities, a story about superstition, faith, and redemption in a rural community. But in execution, it veered into melodrama and caricature. Hepburn, with her refined New England accent and sophisticated bearing, seemed entirely misplaced as a rough-hewn Appalachian woman. Audiences and critics noticed. Reviews at the time were unkind, some even mocking. The New York Times called the film embarrassing, noting that Hepburn's mannerisms clashed with the character she was meant to portray. The film performed poorly, and for Hepburn, who valued her credibility above all else, it was a blow. Years later, she reportedly laughed at the memory, calling it one of her worst roles. But the regret wasn't just about the critical reception. For Hepburn, Spitfire symbolized the dangers of being rushed into roles by the studio system. Stars had little control over the parts they played. Contracts bound them to accept whatever the studio assigned. And for Hepburn, this meant trusting executives who didn't always understand her strengths. Spitfire revealed how mismatched she could be when stripped of her natural sharpness and forced into a caricature. Behind the scenes, Hepburn's frustration grew. She was known for her independence, often clashing with producers and refusing to play by Hollywood's rules. She dressed in slacks instead of gowns, spoke her mind in interviews, and resisted being molded into a glamour queen. Spitfire felt like the opposite of everything she stood for, an attempt to make her conform, to shoehorn her into a role that had no truth to it. Yet, like so many missteps in her career, Hepburn used it as fuel. The film may have been a failure. Montgomery Clift and the Misfits, 1961. On paper, The Misfits, 1961, should have been a triumph. Directed by John Huston, written by Arthur Miller, and starring three of the most luminous names in Hollywood: Marilyn Monroe, Clark Gable, and Montgomery Clift, it promised greatness. Yet for Clift, the film became a painful reminder of his own struggles. What should have been a defining role instead became a project he later looked back on with regret, overshadowed by turmoil both on and off the screen. By the time Clift stepped onto the Nevada desert set, he was already one of the most respected actors of his generation. His performances in A Place in the Sun, 1951, From Here to Eternity, 1953, and The Heiress, 1949, had marked him as a sensitive, brooding figure, bringing a new kind of vulnerability to male stardom, in contrast to the stoic heroes of earlier decades. Yet, his career had also been interrupted by tragedy. In 1956, Clift suffered a devastating car accident that left his face partially disfigured and his health permanently compromised. Though he returned to work, the accident haunted his performances and eroded his confidence. When he was cast in The Misfits, Clift was eager to prove himself again. He played Perce Howland, a kind-hearted but broken rodeo rider searching for meaning in a world that seemed to be passing him by. The role, poetic and tragic, should have fit him perfectly. And in some ways, it did. Critics later noted that his fragile presence added layers of authenticity to the character. But behind the camera, the experience was grueling. The set of The Misfits was famously chaotic. Director John Huston clashed with cast and crew, often leaving the production to go gambling. Arthur Miller, who wrote the screenplay for his then-wife Marilyn Monroe, struggled as their marriage fell apart before the world's eyes. Monroe herself was in declining health, frequently late to set, and racked with self-doubt. Clark Gable, though still charismatic, was aging and weary. Into this storm walked Clift, who was already battling his own demons of pain and addiction. Friends later recalled that Clift felt increasingly alienated during filming. His health required constant medical supervision, and his performance was often slowed by exhaustion. Though he poured himself into the role, he confided that he didn't feel proud of the film. In a rare moment of candor, Clift told friends that The Misfits had been too close to the bone. Watching the character's loneliness and vulnerability on screen mirrored his own private struggles so painfully that he could hardly bear to see it. The tragedy deepened when the film became linked with loss. Clark Gable died just days after shooting wrapped, reportedly exhausted by the demands of the film's physical sequences. Monroe would die just over a year later, under tragic circumstances. For Clift, these deaths cast a shadow over the film, turning what should have been a professional accomplishment into a haunting memory. Joan Crawford in Trog, 1970. Few stars embodied Hollywood glamour like Joan Crawford. From her early days as a flapper in the silent era to her Oscar-winning turn in Mildred Pierce, 1945, she reigned as one of MGM's brightest queens, a symbol of elegance, strength, and star power. That golden image was beginning to fade. Studios were changing, audiences were turning to new kinds of stars, and Crawford, once untouchable, found herself grasping for roles. The result was Trog, 1970, a film she would come to regret deeply, and one that symbolized the cruel way Hollywood often treated its aging icons. In Trog, Crawford played Dr. Brockton, an anthropologist who discovers a half-human, half-ape creature living in a cave. She attempts to study him, to teach him human ways, and ultimately protect him from fearful townsfolk. On paper, it was a mix of science fiction and horror, but in execution, it was pure camp. The creature costume was unconvincing, the story meandered, and Crawford's refined performance seemed hopelessly out of place in a movie that looked more like a low-budget monster flick than a serious drama. For Crawford, who had built her career on sophistication and strength, the role was humiliating. She had spent decades fighting for respect in Hollywood, surviving studio politics, and reinventing herself time and again. But in the twilight of her career, the offers had dwindled. Once studios lined up to give her starring vehicles, now she was left with projects like Trog, which even she admitted was beneath her. Behind the scenes, the production underscored the difficulties of her situation. By 1970, Crawford was in her 60s and struggling to maintain her once commanding presence. She still carried herself with dignity, always arriving on set immaculately prepared. But she knew this was not the material worthy of her name. Colleagues noted her professionalism, but also her sadness. As one crew member later recalled, she gave it everything, but you could see in her eyes, she knew this wasn't the way she wanted people to remember her. The critics were merciless. The New York Times dismissed the film as a travesty, and many reviewers expressed shock that a star of Crawford's stature would appear in such a project. Audiences, too, seemed baffled. For younger viewers, the film was forgettable. For older fans, it was painful to watch their idol reduced to such material. Crawford herself later withdrew from acting altogether, retiring not long after Trog. She refused to discuss the film in interviews, as if acknowledging it would tarnish the image she had fought to preserve for so long. Yet, within this regret lies a poignant truth about Hollywood. Crawford's story wasn't unique. Many of her peers, Bette Davis, Gloria Swanson, Mae West, also found themselves pushed into questionable roles when studios no longer saw value in older actresses. The system that had once elevated them to extreme heights offered little dignity in return when their youth had passed. Trog became Crawford's last film not because she wanted it that way, but because it reminded her how little respect the industry gave to its veterans.